Well, here we are, and believe me, I would rather be doing this live and in person than preaching to a camera. I'm not really accustomed to that, but life has recently been inconvenienced, to say the least. The elders made a wise and prudent decision to not meet under these most unusual circumstances. The coronavirus has seriously impeded our way of life. In these United States, schools have been closed, workers sent home, movie theaters shut down, and restaurants have gone to takeout only. Just recently, after the Ohio restaurants were shut down, our family went to a restaurant in another state, and the manager brought the food to our table and informed us. He said, "Well, here's your last meal." And we're like, "Excuse us?" And he said that he meant this was the last meal that anyone would be able to have out for a while because the governor was closing down all the restaurants. We were like the last ones in, and the door was locked behind us. And look at what this has done to sports. This has given a whole new meaning to the term March Madness. There are lots of disappointed fans, lots of disappointed athletes. Consider the high school seniors who have worked hard for many years to get to the championship tournament, and now either the tournament or at least the championship game is not going to be played. Or think of the disappointed NCAA basketball stars, one of whom was not able to play in the tournament last year because of an injury, but this year he looked forward to it, and now his last opportunity has gone. And then there's the other guy, the other NCAA player who looked forward to playing his next game and coming up to 1,000 points. He lacked one game. He would have had 1,000 points, and now that game isn't going to be played. And he was a senior too, last opportunity. My own family recently encountered some disappointment as we were packing to leave for Missouri to go to my father-in-law's 90th birthday party. We got the news the night before as we were packing that the party wouldn't happen because the assisted living facility in which Gretchen's parents live is on lockdown. No one comes in, no one goes out, and so there's not going to be a party, at least not now. But even worse, some folks had wedding plans. I know of one bride who planned a big wedding, but now all the guests have been uninvited, and she's settled for a small ceremony officiated by her minister father. And even funerals are not allowing everyone to come, just private affairs with the family for the most part. So the lockdowns, shutdowns, curfews, and quarantines, not to mention the confusion about how to vote, has left a lot of people reeling. But thankfully, inconvenience is about the worst that most of us have experienced. It could be worse. We pray it doesn't get worse. Some may find themselves tempted to live in fear. And just what kinds of fears might people be facing right now? Well, I'm going to list a few of them, not to scare you, but to ask how the Scripture might address the concept of living in fear, or the temptation of living in fear. And one of the most common fears that people have is, what if I or one of my family members get the coronavirus? Will health care be available, and will it be efficient? How bad might the symptoms be? Will there be long-term physical damage? Will I or my loved ones survive? Another question people are asking is how this might change the face of the nation. Some are concerned about government overreach. The powers of federal government often expand after a national crisis of this nature. The New Deal, the creation of the FBI, and the Patriot Act all grew out of national crises. And so it will be interesting to see if any new federal programs or agencies evolve out of this. The balance between liberty and security continues to be a concern. Some people are concerned because they fear a financial meltdown. A number of people have been laid off work. More than ever, people are signing up for unemployment, and some have been forced to work fewer hours. With the stock market having lost its recent gains, some are afraid that their retirement isn't going to be as comfortable as they originally thought. And of course, a fear that enters a lot of people's minds is this: what if we run out of toilet paper? But we as Christians have no need to fear. The most oft repeated command in the Bible is, "Fear not," or do not be afraid, depending upon your translation. Psalm 27 begins like this in verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Times like these are a great challenge in regard to putting our trust in God. Our faith in God is being tested, which can strengthen us and actually make us better people if we allow it. It has to do with our attitude. It has to do with how we pay attention to our hearts. We cannot control the stock market. We can't control the state. We cannot control the spread of germs. Not that there is nothing we can do about any of these things, but it isn't up to any one of us. We must work together. The one constant upon which we can all depend in Psalm 27:1 is that the Lord is the stronghold of my life. I like the way that makes that personal. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. What is a stronghold? A stronghold is a well-protected fortress. It's like a fort or a walled city or a citadel high above where you are safe and have the advantage over your enemies. A stronghold is a place of safety. Our stronghold is the Lord. He is how we get by. We cannot trust in our investments to take care of us. We cannot trust in the government to take care of us. We cannot even trust in the military or masks and hand sanitizers to keep us safe. Not that any of these things are unnecessary and not that they cannot help, because they can, but if you're looking for guaranteed outcomes, none of these things can deliver. You can be a complete germaphobe, and then someone sneezes on you at Walmart. We live in a world of risk, a world of danger, and there are no real guarantees. The one stronghold of our lives is God. He isn't going anywhere. His power is not diminishing. His plans are not readjusted because of people's decisions. He is independent and autonomous of the stock market. He is the king whose monarchy will never end. He is stronger than any military on earth, and he continues to reign despite whatever form of government takes shape. And with the Lord as our stronghold, the psalmist continues, of whom shall I be afraid? The answer to this rhetorical question is no one. We're to fear nothing and no one as Christians. We have no reason to fear. We certainly have no reason to panic. That doesn't preclude taking precautions. But worrying or living in fear is not going to help anyone. We needn't fear our enemies. The president says that we are fighting a war right now, and the enemy is invisible. And that's true. The enemy is invisible. The virus is out there, and no one can see it coming. It is stealthy and hidden and attacks without warning. But we cannot afford to let this unseen enemy defeat us. Of his own enemies, the psalmist, who was probably David, says this in verses 2 and 3, when the wicked advance against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. While David's enemies were human, our invisible enemy has been advancing as cases of the coronavirus keep multiplying. Some translations of verse 2 mention the wicked adversaries advancing against David to devour his flesh. Now that doesn't mean that David's enemies were literally cannibals, but it means that they intended harm. And the coronavirus intends harm. Its symptoms may vary from person to person, including everything from high fever to headache to shortness of breath or coughing. And those who've had it do not report having had any fun with it. This is something that we do not want. This is something that we want to avoid. So yes, we need to be careful. But as Christians, we don't need to fear, because this too shall pass. Things will get back to normal. Well, I'm confident that this contagion will finally cease, just as the psalmist expected his enemies to stumble and fall. There is no guarantee that every individual will survive this. Most people do, but even if you don't, as a Christian, your life will go on. Jesus came to defeat the greatest enemies, which are sin and death. The underlying forces of all that is wrong with the world is sin and death. Life-threatening illness is but one consequence of living in a fallen world. When sin came into the world, it brought mortality with it. But Jesus gave us the option of seeking immortality. He is the resurrection and the life, and those who believe in him will never die, according to John chapter 11. David continued expressing his confidence in Psalm 27, verse 13, where he writes, "I remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." So when David wrote about the land of the living, he was not talking about the afterlife, of which so little had been revealed by the time of his writing, but he was confident that he would survive the current crisis. He would survive this attack from his enemies. And while there is no guarantee that you won't die from COVID-19 or something else, we Christians know that even if we die, we live. Because for us, it's a win-win situation because we get to go and be with the Lord. That doesn't mean that there's any excuse for recklessness because the Lord wants us to stay on earth and serve him for as long as possible. But the time will come for each of us to go to him. If this current crisis teaches us anything, it should be how quickly circumstances can change, how quickly plans can be thwarted. You cannot take anything in this world for granted, and when it comes your time to die, you just might not have everything on your to-do list checked off. But the one thing that you don't want to procrastinate about, if you're procrastinating about anything, the one thing you don't want to put off is taking care of your eternal salvation. Life is uncertain, and we need to be ready to go at a moment's notice. We need to be ready. The land of the living in this psalm definitely referred to David's expectation of continued life on this current earth. But for Christians, the phrase land of the living can be injected with new meaning, can be infused with new nuance. For beyond this current earth, there will be a land of the living for those who dwell with God forever. But in the meantime, David was content to dwell in the house of the Lord. In verse 4, he says, "One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and gaze on the beauty of the Lord, and seek him in his temple." To dwell in the Lord's temple was to dwell in his presence. To the ancient Israelites, the presence of God was most acute in the temple at Jerusalem. Now that doesn't mean that God wasn't present everywhere, because as David says, or as he asks rhetorically in Psalm 139, verse 7, "Where can I flee from your presence?" And the answer, of course, is nowhere. There is nowhere you can go that God is not present. And while he is present, worship in the temple was a reminder of this to the ancient Israelites. It was considered to be the place where heaven and earth intersect. It's where people went to go and worship together and seek the face of God, to use the wording of verse 8. "My heart says of you, seek his face." And where might Christians today seek the face of God but in our corporate worship gatherings? In the worship assembly, of course. And in 1 Corinthians 3:16, we're reminded, or it makes it clear there, that it's now the church collectively that makes up God's temple. God dwells in our midst, and there is at no place or time at which it is more acute and apparent than when we gather for worship. The problem for us right now is that we're not able to meet. So we must resort to other measures. When Israel had been carried away into Babylonian captivity, they felt as though they had a lack of access to God because of their lack of access to the temple. And so they felt separated from his presence, and they lamented in Psalm 137, verse 1, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept as we remembered Zion." They longed to seek the face of God through worship, but they asked in verse 4, "How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land?" Some of us may be asking a similar question. How can I worship God outside the assembly? How can I worship God outside the church building? How can I sing songs of praise to the Lord in my living room? Well, thanks to today's technology, we can at least gather virtually. We can gather virtually, and of course that's no substitute for gathering in person, and hopefully when this is all over we'll get right back to that with corporate worship every Sunday. I was encouraged by the elders' recent presentation they did, in which we were informed with a visual to help us understand that our attendance had been being steady, even going up at times since last year. And with this coronavirus threat, I really hate to see that momentum broken. And hopefully when we get back together, we can get right back to that and start gathering with as many as possible. But I was encouraged by that, and I hated to see this coronavirus come along, as we all did. But when this is over, and it will be over, we need to again consider Hebrews 10:25, which says, "Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another." The exhortation was written in the context of persecution. When people were being inhibited from gathering together, they were being criticized for meeting in the name of Christ. And while that's not inhibiting us right now, we look forward to meeting again when we can. You might say that, like David, we seek to dwell in the house of the Lord. The house of the Lord, in the context of Psalm 27, is not heaven, but it's the temple. And we are now the temple. As we gather to assemble, we come together in the house of the Lord. And now the house of the Lord is not a building made with hands, but we are the Lord's building. And we will again dwell in the house of the Lord. This experience might be a good reminder of what Stephen said in Acts 7:48. "The Most High does not live in houses made by men." That being the case, we are nevertheless thankful for a place to worship, a place to meet, but right now we have to improvise. So we gather virtually. Perhaps you can sing songs of praise at home with your family. Maybe you can watch videos like this one. Grape juice and tortillas, which have no yeast in them, are readily available at the store. Not a big run on grape juice like there is toilet paper. And so communion is possible. Offerings can still be mailed in, and we're working on a way that people can even give online. And if you don't already have information on that, that may be forthcoming. But setting aside time for worship, we can still do that, and it's as important as ever. And this includes exposure to God's Word. As David says in Psalm 27:11, "Teach me your way, Lord. Lead me in a straight path because of my oppressors." So the oppressors make this meeting in the way of the Lord and learning His paths even more urgent. And of course, our oppressor right now is the threat of this virus. We may not have oppressors in the sense of David or ancient Israel or the first disciples. But we may still, in this context that we're in, we may feel somewhat oppressed. We cannot go out to a restaurant. We cannot do sports. We cannot go to school. We cannot even go to church. And of course that may depend upon where you live, but this can get old rather quickly. But we've not yet seen what God is going to do with this. So before getting impatient, remember the words of Psalm 27:14, "Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart. Wait for the Lord." I'm a firm believer in Romans 8:28, which says that in all things God works together for the good of those who love Him. I am very much a believer in that, and the coronavirus is not good. Make no mistake about that. It's part of the darkness that has come into the world. But according to verse 1, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? What are some good things that might come out of this crisis if we continue to seek the face of God? It could be that with the restaurants closed, families might actually rediscover the dining room dinner table. Families may find themselves eating together again, visiting together, and maybe playing games when they're quarantined inside. And what will Americans do without all of the time and the bukus of money spent on sports ball? How can we Americans survive without our sports ball? Oh, we'll manage. And we'll probably manage a bit better than we think we will. We might think of more creative uses for the time and money that is often spent on this multi-billion-dollar industry. Not that I'm against sports, but since we've been forced to spend our times in other ways, let's make those some creative and constructive ways. And church members are finding new ways to serve one another. We come through for each other. We always have in a crisis. Opportunities for ministry abound. And I know a lot of folks who've been calling up and checking on one another, a great thing to do. And in addition to ministering to each other, let us be especially mindful of the elderly who are most susceptible to this. Do they need anything? Is there any way that we can help them? Let's be mindful of those in the healthcare industry. While some are having to leave work and take almost a little vacation, the healthcare workers don't get any vacation. They're just now ramping this up, and that includes those who clean the medical facilities, disinfecting for the germs, and these people do a great job for very little pay. Remember those in retail who are essential because of the products and groceries that have to stay and remain available, and be aware, be mindful of the truck drivers who deliver these items. Be mindful of the mail carriers who perform an important service. Remember the first responders and the National Guard. Don't take these people for granted. And remember our government leaders who have to make very difficult decisions, and no matter what they decide, it will always be criticized. Remember the factory workers who have to keep producing. Remember those who've been laid off. Remember the educators and students whose lives and schedules have been upended. And I cannot cover everyone. I'm sure I'll probably hear about someone I left out, but just remember each other. Lift everyone in the nation and in the world up in prayer during this most unusual time in history. It's going to take patience to get through this, but this too shall pass. And so I leave you with Psalm 27, verse 14. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord.